All right. Well, thank you for your patience, everyone, and thank you for being here on Friday night. On behalf of the event team, I would like to welcome AJ Jacobs. AJ is a New York Times bestselling author, as well as a journalist, lecturer, and self-proclaimed guinea pig, whose books include Drop Dead Healthy, The Year of Living Biblically, and The Puzzler. His most recent release, The Year of Living Constitutionally, chronicles his hilarious adventures in attempting to follow the original Constitution as he searches for answers to one of the most pressing issues of our time. How should we interpret America's most foundational document? Of The Year of Living Constitutionally, Publishers Weekly said, Jacobs' well-researched romp carefully reckons with the Constitution's ethical blind spots while staying consistently entertaining. U.S. history buffs will have fun with this one. Kirkus Reviews says it's a marvelously witty and wise consideration of the Constitution's legacy, and the New York Post calls it hilarious and illuminating. Tonight, AJ will be talking about his book, and then he will have a chance to ask, or for you to ask him some questions about it as well. So without further ado, welcome AJ Jacobs.
Once again, apologies. I did bring my quill, pen, and ink. So I will be signing if anyone wants any books or anything else signed. So I'll stay as long as it takes. Well, thank you again for coming. This is very exciting. This is actually my first bookstore. This is it. I have no idea what I'm doing. We'll see. So yes, I am very excited about this book. As you can see, I didn't wear the whole thing. I thought I might be pulled over or something. So just the tricorn. But I loved writing this book, and this came about. It's sort of a semi-sequel to a book I wrote many years ago called The Year of Living Biblically. And that one came about because I grew up in a very secular home. I say in that book, I'm Jewish in the same way the Olive Garden is Italian. But I wanted to learn about the Bible and my heritage. So I thought the way I like to learn as a writer is to immerse myself and live it. So I decided to commit myself to living a year following the Bible as literally as possible. And so I did the 10 Commandments, the famous ones, but I also did the lesser known ones. The Bible says you cannot shave the corners of your beard. I didn't know where the corners were, so I just let the whole thing grow. And it was quite some topiary. It was like down to here. The Bible says you cannot wear clothes made of 2 different kinds of fabrics. So I said, all right, it says that. I'm getting rid of my poly cotton blends. So I went the whole way. And it was fascinating. There were parts that were not so pleasant. I had to stone an adulterer, but I used pebbles. So no one actually got hurt. But there are also wonderful parts. I learned about gratitude and forgiveness. Thank you for forgiving me for being late. And the beauty of ritual is another one. And also another big takeaway was, maybe don't take the Bible completely literally, as many fundamentalists say they are doing. I was sort of trying to be the ultimate fundamentalist and show this is probably, first of all, the folks who say they're taking it literally are not going the whole way. I was like, I'm doing it without picking and choosing. And then even if you do take it somewhat literally, it's probably not the best way to approach it. You could take the Bible seriously without taking it literally. You don't have to take it just because it says the world was created in 6 days doesn't mean you have to believe it was 5,000 years old. So I always thought, even back then, that I could do a sequel on the Constitution, because I do believe we treat those 2 texts in somewhat similar ways. We see there's a group that says you have to follow the literal meaning, the textualists. You have to what the words say is what they mean. And then there's another group who say, no, the words, the meaning evolves. It's a process. And as society changes, you wrestle with the meaning and sort of, it's a more metaphorical, not quite so literal. So I always had that in the back of my mind. And then a couple of years ago, originalism, which is a judicial philosophy that's been around for, well, it depends who you ask, but it sort of gained popularity in the 80s. And a couple of years ago, the majority of the Supreme Court identified as originalists. So 5 of the 6 conservative justices said they were originalists, which is the philosophy that the most important thing when interpreting the Constitution is the literal meaning of the words. And that has affected, hugely impacted our lives in hundreds of ways, in what we what we can carry, where we go to school, and what we can do with our bodies. So the Dobbs decision was a originalist decision. The Bruin decision, which was about guns, was a. So I thought, all right, this is the time. This is the time to explore the original meaning of the Constitution and become the original originalist. So that was my. So what I did was I gathered, as I always do, a board of advisors. So I had constitutional scholars from all over the political spectrum. And then I just went all in, and I bought myself a musket, which I was gonna bring today, but I don't know if you can cross state lines. So I went on ye old internet, and I bought a musket, a real one from like the 1790s. And I bore it around New York, as is my Second Amendment right. I carried it on the Upper West Side, and mixed reactions. I got some people who would cross the street to avoid me, and some it did come in handy once. I arrived at a coffee shop at the same time as this other guy, and he said, "You go first." Well, that can come in handy. I tried to adopt the technology as of the 18th century as well, just to get in the mindsets of our founding fathers. And so I wrote much of it, much of the book with a quill pen, which I brought today, as I said. And you can also try it out if you want to try out what a quill pen is like, if you haven't tried that. I love it. My wife hates the sound. It's like a very scratchy sound, but I love it. And it's also, I will say, it changes the way you write and think, because there are no dings and pings from the internet. It's just, you can actually concentrate, which is a weird feeling for, I hadn't done that in quite some time. I had tried to express my Third Amendment right to quarter soldiers in my house, because this is a Third Amendment. And so it's up there, was that you don't have to have soldiers board in your house without your permission. And this was a big deal because in the Revolution, the British would before the Revolution, they would put their soldiers in people's houses. So this was a big deal back then. But it also says if you do consent to have quarters board in your house, then that's okay too. So I thought, all right, it seems like a nice thing to do, is to board a soldier. So it was very challenging to find a soldier, I will say. So I put it on Craigslist. I went to Times Square and during Fleet Week with all the sailors, and said, I'm trying to express my Third Amendment rights. And I was in my tricorn hat, and they all seem to have other plans, I guess. But I was able to, a friend of a friend of a friend was a soldier who boarded in my house, and he was very polite. I was also, I expressed my right to petition. This was in the First Amendment, and you can petition Congress for redress of grievances. And I thought long and hard, what should my petition be? First of all, I wanted to petition the old way, not on the internet. I felt like the good old way with a big roll of paper and hundreds of signatures written with a quill pen, of course. The one I chose, some of my favorite movements throughout constitutional history have been to try to expand the power from and try to diversify the power. And I decided that I would focus on an attempt for Congress to reconsider an idea that was brought up during the Constitutional Convention, which I found fascinating because during the convention, this delegate named James Wilson got up and he said, they'd all agreed we should have three branches, most of them. So judicial, legislative, executive. But how would the executive be structured? And what James Wilson got up and said, well, let's have a single president at the head of the executive. And several of the other delegates said, are you jesting? That is crazy. He just fought a bloody war with England to get rid of a monarch. And Randolph, I think, called it, he said, that's the fetus of monarchy. We cannot have a single president. That person will just gain power and become a monarch. And so he said, maybe three presidents. Let's do three presidents. Someone else, Ben Franklin, was in favor of 12 presidents. So that would be interesting. But three presidents, I was like, I like that idea. Now, I don't genuinely want Trump, Biden, and RFK Jr. like co-working in the Oval Office. That I think would be a bad idea. But the idea was just to remind people the president right now has way too much power. This is not what the founders intended. The fetus of monarchy turned out to be very prescient. It is not just a fetus anymore. I think the fetus is a toddler. The president has way more power than was intended. He has war power, he has trade power that is just not, I don't think it's American. So I started this petition to get three presidents back on the back in circulation. And I actually brought it to a sitting senator, Senator Ron Wyden, in my tricorn hat and the whole coat. And he was very polite. He said it was an interesting idea, which meant that he considered it for 5 seconds. But he agreed with the general idea that the president is too powerful and that Congress needs to regain some of its power. So that was exciting. I went with another congressperson, Ro Khanna from California, because there's another part of the Constitution that says that Congress has the power and citizens have the power, the rights to become basically legal pirates. They're called privateers, but it is back in the Revolution, we didn't have much of a navy. So we outsourced it. The government said, if you're a fisherman and you want to put a cannon on your boat, you can go out and you can capture British ships. You get to keep the booty. You get to keep the sherry. It was a big one. They had lots of clothes, and it's still in the Constitution. It is. It hasn't been. It's called a letter of marque and reprisal. Congress can grant a letter of marque and reprisal. So I said, let's try it. And there hasn't been one granted since 1815, but it is in there. And if I'm following my rights as literally as possible, let's go. So I met with Ro Khanna, who's a congressman from California, and I said, I presented him with my application. At first, he was very enthusiastic. He's like, let's make this happen. And then, but he didn't know what I was asking. He just wanted to, he's a politician. He wanted to please me. So then I explained what it was, and he's like, wait, So you would go in your friend's water skiing boat to the Taiwan Straits. He's like, yeah, exactly. And he's like, oh, well, I'll have to think of something. But he actually liked the premise of the book because he's a constitutional fan and scholar. So he brought it up in Congress. I don't think it went very far, or brought it up with his colleagues. But he does email me occasionally and address me as captain. So that's I feel good about that. So those are some examples of what I did during my year of living constitutionally. But I wanted to talk now for a little bit about some of the bigger lessons. Since I did this, I hope it's an entertaining book. It's got some jests and japes, but I also meant it to be serious, and I took it very seriously and trying to figure out what should the role of the Constitution be in our lives. I love talking about this, so I want to hear your questions, but let me give you, I was going to do 10 because of the Bill of Rights, but I think that would take too long. So I'm going to do 5 sort of takeaways, and the rest are in the book for you to read. One is just the idea, I got a lot of people who would say, why should we even pay attention to this document written 237 years ago by 55 white men, some of whom were slave owners? So why not just ignore it completely? And what I thought was interesting is it's a lot about how you frame the Constitution. I'm not talking about the actual titanium frame with xenon gas inside because they want to keep it, but how we frame, and this has been a theme throughout American history. So before the Civil War, there were 2 very famous abolitionists. There was William Lloyd Garrison, who was a white man who said that the Constitution is a pact with the devil. He said, because it allowed slavery to continue. And he said, this pact with the devil, we should burn it. And he was a showman, so he burned it. He would go on stage and burn the Constitution in front of hundreds of people. Frederick Douglass was another former enslaved man, and who became one of the great orators of all time. And at first he was on William Lloyd Garrison's side, that this was something to be burned and just gotten rid of. But at sometime in the 1850s, he's changed his mind. And by the way, do I talk? Yes, changing the mind, I think, is another very important theme that I'll talk about in a moment. But he changed his mind and he said, instead of burning it, let's frame it as a promissory note, because it does contain this wonderful language of liberty and equality and the general welfare and all of these wonderful concepts. But he said that America is not living up to those promises. So let's look at it as a promissory note and say, let's make America live up to the wonderful words and concepts in the Constitution that not even the founders themselves lived up to. And I love that. I love that framing, and it is very influential. It's Martin Luther King used that language of promissory note. Obama gave a great speech on race where he talked about that basically the solution to the Constitution's problems are in the Constitution itself, that the seeds of equality and liberty are there. We just have to make them come to fruition. So that was one takeaway. It's a lot about how you frame the Constitution. Another is what I just mentioned. I love that Frederick Douglass changed his mind, and I felt when I was reading, I changed my mind on so many topics while reading this, and I'm happy about that. I think it's a shame that changing your mind, especially as politicians, is seen as something to be ashamed of, flip-flopping, when in fact it should be celebrated. And the founders were actually quite good at changing their mind. They had a lot of flaws, but one thing, the way they were better than current politicians was that they would be open-minded. So for instance, Ben Franklin, my favorite founding father, he said the older he gets, the less certain he is of his own opinions. I love that. He also said, this was at the Constitutional Convention, he told a little joke. He liked his japes. So he said, told the story of this French lady who said to her sister, I don't understand it. It's so strange, she said. Why is it that I'm the only person I've ever met who is right on every single issue? And so Franklin got some laughs. I'm proud of him after 250 years. Yeah, so his point, of course, was that we're all that French lady. We all think that we're right on every issue. I mean, this was 200 years before Daniel Kahneman and all this behavioral economics, where we realized how that I'm super impressed. So he was very into changing his mind. James Madison, just to give you one other example, is his last words on earth were about that he changed his mind. The story is, and it is a story, but I choose to believe it. He was on his deathbed and his niece was there, and James Madison made a strange face, and his niece said, "What's the matter, uncle?" And he said, "Oh, nothing, I just changed my mind," and then died. So we don't know what he changed his mind on. It could be the bicameral legislature, it could be the wallpaper. We'll just never know. But the fact is, his last action on earth was to change his mind. And I love that. And one of the favorite activities I did was I held an 18th century dinner party at my apartment. My son, who likes to cook, he made the beef stew. A lot of cloves. They love their cloves. So we had beef stew with cloves. I tried to start it light by telling some jokes from an 18th century jest book. They're not great. They're not good. I'll give you just one example. It was a woman was married to a mathematician and they had no children. And her friend said, "Oh, your husband is such a wonderful mathematician." And she said, "Yes, but he cannot multiply." It worked. All right, that's good. I called it a dad joke, but a founding dad joke. Sort of a meta dad joke. The dad joke about a dad joke. But after that, we got into talking about what are the strengths and weaknesses of the Constitution. What should we change? And I loved it because I had purposely invited people from all over the political spectrum in the hopes that we would maybe have a discussion and change our mind. I don't think anyone made any huge leaps, but we talked and we saw the other side, and maybe a few dozen other dinners, and we can actually make some progress. But the point is, we all agree. The one thing we did agree on is that it was a wonderful feeling to talk, to sit there and have a face-to-face, civil, lovely conversation, trying to figure out these hard issues instead of screaming at each other anonymously over online. All right, another big takeaway was that I started the book on election day of 2022, and I ended on election day of 2023. And I did try to replicate some of the original ways that people voted. First of all, they did not have a secret ballot. The secret ballot came much later. Most states, you would vote by voice. It was you would actually go up and you would say in front of the whole community who you were voting for. One argument is that it made your vote more communal. You weren't voting for your own personal, you were voting for what's good for the community. I don't buy that. I think you would be pressured to vote. Like, if your boss is there, you're gonna have to vote the one. So I'm very grateful uh, for the secret ballot, the Australian ballot, as it's sometimes called. But another thing that was, interesting about voting in the late 1700s was, for those who could vote, and that's a big asterisk because it was restricted to pretty much white males. And we don't want to go back to that, of course. But for those who could vote, it was this amazing right that they had never had before. And it was something that filled them with awe and joy. So it was election day was festive for those who could vote. It wasn't quite Coachella or Burning Man, I don't think, but they had music, they had farmers markets, they had parades, they had a lot of rum, they were big day drinkers and night drinkers, and they had election cakes. They had election cakes, which were these cakes that people would bake with cloves, of course, and bring them to the polls. A tradition started in the great state of Connecticut.
Yay.
That's right. You started election cakes. And I thought this is a lovely thing we can try to resurrect. So I did start this movement to bring back the election cake. I used Facebook, which I know is not 18th century-ish, but it is one of the older social apps. So it's like, at least it's closer, but it's not like or whatever WhatsApp. But I got hundreds of people in all 50 states to join me in this movement to bake election cakes and bring them to the polls or bring them to work and try to remind people that this is a wonderful thing that we do get to vote. It's a flawed democracy. We've got to fix it. We've got lots of ways to fix it, like gerrymandering and making it easier to vote. But we should celebrate the fact that we still do have some democracy. And the catchphrase is democracy is sweet. And I made pins for my book party of Democracy is Sweet, and I still have some left over. So if anyone wants a Democracy is Sweet pin after, then please tell me. But it was weirdly emotional for me because it was one of the people and the reactions that I had from people who I was giving it away to was so nice. It was like, people were like, I've been so depressed about politics. There's been just a negative cascade of horribleness. And, this is a nice little slice of cake is a little beam of positivity. And so that moved me. But then all these other people had the same experiences, and they would email me their photos and stories of how it was this one positive action that they could take in this very dark time. And hopefully I'm not saying, that we don't want to end with the cake, but it's a nice wedge in the door that we can use to try to restore some pride in voting and make actual reforms. So I loved that. That was a big takeaway, the joy of trying to restore joy in elections. All right, so I'll do one more because they went on a little longer. I may just do 4 because I want to hear your questions, and that's my favorite part. So I'll just end with this idea of part of the reason I went into this was, part of it was this idea of originalism and how literally should we take the Constitution and how much should it be stretched. In the end, you can read, I tried to present arguments on both sides because I do believe in steel manning. That's a phrase I love. It's the opposite of straw manning. So you try to present the other argument as strongly as possible. So I do try to steel man originalism, and you can read, and I understand why it holds some allure. But in the end, I don't think that we should focus solely on the original meaning of the Constitution. I do think that you have to take other factors into account, including the consequences on society today, the how the Supreme Court has ruled recently, how it'll affect the institution of the Supreme Court, for instance. So I do believe more in what's called living constitutionalism. Sometimes it's called pluralism or pragmatism. I like pluralism because I like the idea of looking at an issue from multiple lenses. Some of you might, you know, the hedgehog and the fox. There's a famous Isaiah Berlin essay about there's people who are hedgehogs and there are people who are foxes. Hedgehogs look at the world through one single lens. Everything goes through that lens. That could be Marxism, it could be religion, it could be free market capitalism, or it could be originalism. That is the way they look at the Constitution. I prefer the multiple lenses, looking at a problem from many different angles. And so to me, living constitutionalism, I prefer to call it pluralism, looking at a decision and taking in many factors, how it will affect the world, not just what did these men in 1787 and 1789 think. So that was part of it. And part of it was the related issue of how can we safeguard democracy? Because I do feel that it is under threat. It's not an on-off switch, like it's not going to be, you know, turned off in 2024, but it's a dimmer. It is a dimmer, and I feel that it is dimmer than it's been in my life. And so there's a great story from the Constitutional Convention of George Washington. He sat in a wooden chair, much like this, that on the back of it had a carving of the sun. Do any of you know this story?
Was it on Sunday morning?
Oh, it was on Sunday morning. I spooked myself. Okay.
It's a good one.
And it was so yes, it was a carving of the sun, but it wasn't the whole sun. It was half the sun. You could only see the top half. It was on the horizon. And so Ben Franklin spent the convention those long months wondering, is that a rising sun or a setting sun? And then at the end of the convention, when against all odds, they had created a constitution and a new country. Ben Franklin decided it is a rising sun. The sun is rising on America. And I love that story because it's all about optimism. And I think that's one of my favorite American traits. But in the past few years, it's, you know, reading all these stories, it's like, is the sun still rising on America? Am I, after this year and talking to hundreds of people and scholars and experiencing life in the 18th century, in the middle of 21st century Manhattan, I do think it can rise, but it's not like the sun, because the sun is controlled by gravity. We don't have any control over the sun. It's a natural phenomenon. Whereas democracy is very much up to us. It's very fragile, and it's all about us putting in the work to make sure that the sun keeps rising. So that was one of my takeaways is, yes, the sun can rise, but only with our help. So I'm optimistic, but with an asterisk. I'm optimistic, but the asterisk is that we have to put in the work and try to reject this temptation towards nihilism and cynicism, and that nothing works, and whatever we do is for naught. And partly because reading the history of the Constitution and the history of America, I mean, we have made progress. We have a long way to go, but I mean, you do not want to live in the 18th century. It was a sexist, racist, smelly, horrible time where medicine consisted of the tobacco enema, where, you know, that was, you would get a stomach ailment and they would literally shoot smoke up your ass. So we don't want that. We have made progress. So I think that's important to remind ourselves we've made progress because that will give us hope that we can make more progress. And my problem with the media, or one of them is, you know, they have just such a relentlessly negative focusing on the problems instead of the solutions. So this book is partly about trying to focus on the solutions and acknowledge the problems. And it was, you know, it was a wonderful experience. I loved it. My wife did not love the smell of the candles, which smelled like they were beef tallow, so they smelled like meatloaf. But and she didn't love the quartering soldier, but she did get dressed up actually and join me because I did fight I wanted to go to a constitutional reenactment society, but there are none because it's not as interesting to reenact the convention as it is to, like, people like the guns and the muskets and stuff. So I joined a Revolutionary War Reenactment Society, the 3rd New Jersey Regiment. I'm a member, and she joined me for some of it. So she did actually get into it. She loves history. So so that's my story. There's lots more in the book. And as I said, I can't wait to sign with my quill pen, and which I carved myself, by the way. That was another fun part of it, sort of a DIY element. And mostly I'm interested to hear what questions you have or what you want to talk about. So I'll end there. But I'm overflowing with esteem and gratitude, and it behooves me to thank you for. Oh, yes.
I wonder, I want to ask, do you feel like, anyone was, because you discussed walking around with the musket and the outfit and the hat at different times. Do you think people were scared of you and took it as sort of a, not overly ambitious, but radicalist political statement?
Oh, that's interesting.
Do you think they were scared of you, or were you scared of other people's interpretation of that at times?
That is interesting. I never thought that maybe they thought like I was actually.
Never
a militia. People were, I got people who would say like, you know, what the hell, man? Other people were actually very excited like by the musket because, and would like, can I hold the musket? So that was exciting. And I will say, my wife hated the musket. She's very anti-gun. So she, but I tried to explain that part of the point of the book was that a musket is very different from a modern gun. Like, it's not going to go off by accident. It takes like 10 minutes to load. It's like building a table and it is not. So part of the point of the book was to show that how different technology was then when they wrote the Second Amendment. So that's interesting. But I did spend time with these reenactors, and you were not allowed to talk politics because they said the rule was you can talk about the Federalists and the Jeffersonians, but you cannot talk about current politics. I got the feeling, I would say it seemed like 70% were pretty Republican, but there was, I would say 30% Democrat, and I was skeptical before meeting them, but I think one of them said, it's just such a joy to talk to people about history. You know, he was just a history, he didn't seem to have an agenda about like, you know, how to interpret that history. He just loved traveling back into the past. And I also thought it was touching when some of them said, you know, I read some of these Revolutionary War memoirs, and they are heartbreaking because these people, you know, walking in the snow without shoes and starving. And so his point was, I want to pay homage to their sacrifice. And this is his way of doing that. I honestly don't know what they would think of it, his homage. Let's simply be like, "Why? We fought a war, so you don't have to do that." But I grew to become friends with several of them. I don't know if that answered your question. I just started rambling, but that was, what else is there?
Is
Yes.
there one set recipe for that cake?
Oh, well, it's interesting that, I mean, the one that started in Hartford, Connecticut it's got cloves and figs and raisins. So it's very like sort of fruit cake.
Yeah.
So it was not universally popular among my bakers, but one recipe was it had like 14 pounds of butter, 10 pounds of sugar, and it was a 70-pound cake. But I can't remember if I mentioned, I'm doing it again in November. So I would love if anyone wants to join the movement. It was fun. Because we had a Facebook page and we all posted our cakes, and people are very creative in their decorations and in the Georgia cake had peaches, and the main one had lobster, not actual lobster, candy lobster. So yes, there is an actual, but you can ignore it. Yes.
Follow-up, do you bring the cake to the polls or do you have it at home with your fellow voters?
Either one. I am not a cake dictator. So people did all sorts of things. Some brought it to the polls, some brought it to the workers. My wife and I made one, and we brought it. I was disturbed by how hungry the poll workers were. Like, they are sacrificing their time, and they are like, and I will say, for the first election, I did provide rum, Martha Washington's rum punch, because I thought that's traditional. But some of the mostly one of the poll workers came, she's like, "Can I have some rum?" And I'm like, "I don't know, like, am I gonna get, am I tilting the election by giving you but she's an adult, she could go buy a 6-pack at the deli." So I'm like, "All right, sure." So, but then I decided to keep things simple, no rum, just the cake. So yeah. Oh, yes.
If you juxtapose the founding fathers versus what we have today as far as leaders, do you think today's leaders are even capable of the kind of compromise that the founding fathers were able to reach?
That's a good question. I think we have, I think the studies show that we've become crazy polarized. And I think the founders, they did not see that coming. They did not see the two-party system coming. George Washington hated the whole idea of factions, as they called it. James Madison knew there would be factions, but he thought it was going to be okay, because he said it's a big country, so you're going to have tons of factions, and they'll be all sort of temporary alliances, and it'll be more like a European Parliament. He thought more than, the 6 or 7 in the European Parliament. He thought there would be tons of factions, and they would all be working together, and a group would agree on something. Obviously, that didn't happen, and we have solidified into these two rigid parties, and it is a huge problem. And I mean, the solutions, I don't know the actual solution. There was a very interesting, after you buy my book or read my book, you don't have to buy. I shouldn't say you don't have to. I recommend, there's a book called Parliamentary America, and it's a political scientist who argues that we should have more of a parliamentary system in America, and that is a better way to have democracy. I don't know if that's true. I mean, but I do know that they were much more experimental in their thinking back then. So what we have now is, I always thought it's so rigid, and it's like, oh, okay, that's the way it's supposed to be. There's no other options. But then you read about the Constitutional Convention and the three presidents idea, that was just one of many, you know. Get rid of states. Hamilton at one point said, let's get rid of states. Why should we have two governments? It's so crazy. Why should we, people are confused. They need one government. Then he got a lot of crap and the next day he said, I'm just kidding. I like states. But I think he was genuine that, you know, it is confused. It's a weird system. It might be the best, it might be good. It has its positives because states can be the laboratory of democracy, for instance. But to get back to the point, I think, I do think that it's incredibly hard to compromise. I don't want to say some of the people in government, I think, are there for the right reasons. They are great public servants. But I think the structure is such that it makes it incredibly hard to compromise. So I don't blame the people alone and think that they're all just greedy narcissists, although some of them are. But I think that given the incentives and the structure, it is very hard to have any bipartisanship, which is a huge problem because we can't amend the Constitution. And that's another thing. The founders didn't think it would be that hard to amend because they didn't think we'd have this crazy two-party system. Yes.
Hi, so kind of piggybacking off the last question, my question is kind of about social generational seasons. So one of the quotes that I really like, and it can be kind of polarizing, is hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times. Do you feel that the ebb and flow from generations affects the effectiveness of a document that is that old? Like, can you see the ins and outs of generations that we don't even have access to, not just the 18th century, but the 19th century, throughout the entire thing? Did they struggle with the same interpretation of the document that we do now? Do you think we're just as far away as they were from that interpretation as we are now from the same interpretation?
Interesting. That is a good one. Well, a couple of thoughts occur to me. I don't know if any of them are quite answering your question, but I would say I see somewhat the ebb and flow, but I do think that, you know, like Martin Luther King says, the arc does point in the right direction. I mean, you look at, even in the amendments themselves, you can see, you know, Black people fought and got the vote, and women got the vote. 18-year-olds got the vote. Good for 18-year-olds. By the way, Jerry Springer was the talk show host, was instrumental in getting that one passed. So I do think overall there are ebbs, but the general point is towards a more democratic America. Now, I do think we're in a dip right now. We're in a dip. We're seeing a little bit of a rollback, but I'm hopeful that the arc will continue in the right direction. And in terms of how other generations interpreted the Constitution, well, it's interesting. According to the scholars I read and talked to, originalism is more of a modern, there were occasional originalists. William Howard Taft might have been in an originalist, but the true originalism started in the 80s as a reaction to the Warren Court, which is a very liberal court, which brought us many of the civil rights landmarks that we know today, like the ban on repealing the bans on intermarriage, and Roe v. Wade and Miranda and all of these stuff. So conservatives were alarmed when they said these are unelected people and they are way ahead of the country. The country is not ready for this. So we do not like this. And that's when they came up with originalism, and it was meant to constrain and restrain judges. So you have to stick to the text. So something like Roe v. Wade, which was partially based on the right to privacy, there is no right to privacy that is explicit in the Constitution. There are hints at it. There are like no unreasonable searches and seizures, but it never says you have the right to privacy. So conservatives are saying, well, yes, we cannot have people just say, oh, it's the right to privacy, and therefore pro-choice should be the law of the land. They said we have to restrain judges and stick to the text. Now, what's weird though is that originalism now does not seem to be constraining judges. Like that they are making decisions that have effects on millions of lives. So originalists now say that that's not the point of originalism. The point of originalism is just to say, what did the founders, what did those words mean? And we stick to that, whether or not it has a massive effect on our lives. So, but to the point of how people interpret it, I don't think that there was as clear a division in the past between living constitutionalism and originalism. Most people were in the pragmatism. They would look at various factors, how it affected the reputation of the court, what the words meant, and then make a decision.
So I was asking because like generationally, it seems like politically through the generations, like the older ones tend to be a little bit more homogenous, you know, not as partitional as they are today. You know what I mean? It's
Right.
not really this or that. It was, this is how it is, you know? It's a little
Right,
bit
it
more
was a
unified.
little more of the fox and less of the hedgehog.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more.
Okay.
I often think a lot about taking risks professionally and having the confidence to do so. For most of us, that's like sharing an innovative opinion at a meeting where it might not be popular and how much anxiety comes with that. And then here I look at you and I've heard you on the radio many times, I've read other books. I'm always so inspired by the risks that you take and you're comfortable putting yourself out there. So I just wondered, did you have a breakthrough moment where you really just started to put yourself out there, or has this always been part of your personality?
Thanks for the question. First of all, I'm not comfortable doing it. It's very awkward. But I do it. I think I guess a couple of thoughts occur to me. One is I announce it right at the start. So then it's even more embarrassing if I don't do it. I also, and this might be a diluted thought, I do think hopefully these projects, as awkward as they are for me, that they'll make my life better in the end. And hopefully my family's life, and even more hopefully the readers, like that you'll see some takeaways that make your life better. So the pain, I'm going to suffer for you. And that does that is a little bit of motivation. It's like, I'm making a complete idiot of myself, but something might come out in the end that would be good. And also, this was the first one where one member of my family actually decided to join me in looking ridiculous, because my son, who is now 20, his favorite comedian is a man named Eric Andre, who does these sort of very awkward performance art pieces in public spaces. And so I'm sort of a much tamer Eric Andre, but he put on the hat and he went out and asked soldiers to quarter, and he was we got signatures for the petition. So that was a new and exciting experience to have someone in my own family supporting my lifestyle. Well, I'm happy to answer more questions and sign any books with the quill pen, of course. But thank you so much for coming, and thank you for waiting.